Welcome to the Mental Advantage Podcast. Whether you're an athlete trying to perform at your best when it counts the most, a coach or business leader trying to get more out of your team, or someone looking for more personal growth, this is the place for you. This podcast is your map to guide you to the right mindset, systems, and strategies you need to become the best version of yourself. And now, here's John Cullen and Brandon Allen.
All right, welcome to the show. Great guest tonight, Dayna Charbonneau from West Virginia University, the director of clinical and sports psychology. And Brandon and I had an opportunity to talk to her on the phone, a little bit of we don't normally do pre-show interviews, but we just had an opportunity to chat on the phone a little bit about what the show was going to be about. And I got to tell you, just like I text you, it's going to be great. I mean, I was really excited about this particular show because she brings, I think the thing that impressed me about her was she wanted to go back and listen to other shows we had done with some of the other people who are in certain roles, like she has at West Virginia. And because she was really about giving the listener the most that she could give, you know what I mean? Right. And I think that's why these folks end up in the jobs they're doing is they're givers. They want to be able to provide a service.
There's no doubt. And we've talked about it. There definitely is a, for lack of a better term, a type, right? They seem to be these individuals that are caring and empathetic. They truly have their clients or the student athlete's best interest at heart. And they're all just high energy folks, right? I mean, it's we've said it several times, but where this industry is headed, it's in some really, really capable hands of some really good doctors and clinicians. And Dr. Charbonneau is definitely one of them.
Absolutely. And she's going to get into a little bit about that, where to Brandon's point, where this role is moving and in the future, where it can go, because we've talked about it. It's already evolved and you're starting to see more and more acceptance of this, sports psychology, mental performance, both at the collegiate and the professional level. So she'll get into some of those things. And I really can't wait for the listeners to hear what she has to say about emotions and emotional flexibility. So this will be one of those that you guys are going to want to really probably listen to a couple of different times, because there's a lot of things that she unpacks that I think will be beneficial to the listener for your personal lives, but also parents and coaches out there.
For sure. And she'll be back.
Oh yeah.
Definitely a guest.
She'll definitely be a repeat.
We'll make another appearance.
Absolutely. Well, enjoy the show with Dr. Charbonneau. All right, Brandon, welcome to the show. Actually, the listeners, Brandon, you were already here.
I'm already here. I've been here, so I'm not sure what you got going on, but yeah, thank you.
I just thought, you wanted welcomed like everybody else.
No, I appreciate that. No, always looking out.
Yeah, well, it's what the least I can do for your efforts.
You're right.
So, we're so excited to have Dayna Charbonneau with us tonight. She's a director of clinical and sports psychology at West Virginia University. Those of you all who know that I am from this great state of West Virginia. So of course I'm excited about this guest, and I had an opportunity to talk to Dr. Charbonneau last week. And it was really, I told Brandon after we'll go ahead and talk to you now, since we're talking about you right in front of you. But I told Brandon, Dayna, that this is going to be outstanding, because I was so excited when I got off the phone. One of the things Brandon and I have been talking about recently is, and I know Aaron Goodson and some of the folks that we've talked to recently, Bailey Nevels and some of those folks. And we were talking about how enthusiastic everybody has been that is in these roles that you're in at WVU. So first of all, welcome to the show. We really appreciate you joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I loved our chat too, and I'm just looking forward to continuing it tonight.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm really interested. I asked this question of a few of them because I don't know if the listeners know exactly. They hear these different titles, and some people call it, they're more the clinical psychology, and some people are just straight sports psychology, whatever the case would be. How do you describe your role to others when people say, "Hey, what is it that you're doing over there at West Virginia University?" How do you answer that?
Yeah, so I guess I don't really use my title when I describe what I do, but I kind of just say I support the mental health and mental performance needs of our student athletes, whether that's individually in a team context or collaboratively with the other folks in the department. We come together and provide some services and resources for them. So I kind of keep it broad like that. I know Dr. Goodson talked about keeping it broad too. And so
right.
I felt him when he said that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think you're probably safe that way. Then nobody can ever accuse you of not doing this one thing that you're supposed to be doing, right? You're like, well, I do really a little bit of everything. So technically not just pigeonholing myself into that. Is pigeonhole the right, is that, Brandon, you're usually on those things.
I'm gonna go ahead and we may edit that one out.
Yeah, already I've not put on a good example for our guests. So
yeah, I don't know that you ever add an ing at the end of whole, like wholly.
Yeah.
So
I don't know. I thought I've heard that before, pigeonholing, but then I'm not really sure if I understand what that would mean. But anyhow. Yeah. So we talked about this, it's kind of a broad title. How do you spend most of your days? Like, is it mostly with coaches, mostly with athletes? Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so it has mostly been with athletes. I think depending on the structure you have in place and the amount of resources and staff you have, I think it'll look different, right, in terms of what you can do with the breadth and the depth of the care you provide. I am an office of one. With a graduate student that I've had. So with that, I do have a lot of individual sessions, whether that's from mental health counseling, mental performance consultation, or we kind of blend both together or go back and forth with both. So a lot of my time is spent individually. Obviously, that's looked different with COVID and doing a lot of things virtually and over Zoom, which was different. We've kind of implemented more like walking sessions outside for folks.
Oh, nice.
To feel comfortable, like being seen with me.
Yes, yeah, sure.
Being seen with me. So that's been kind of cool to add that into my day. But yeah, gradually been trying to find other ways to be outside of the office because I think we're so much more effective when we can be outside of the office. I know other folks you've had on the show have just talked about that visibility piece and how important that is with reducing stigma and increasing the athlete's comfort and trust in us when they see us around all the time. So when I can find time to go to practice, even like showing up in the training rooms and things like that, or at a strength and conditioning workout or something like that, it's just helpful when they see me around. And I'm always amazed how many calls or texts I'll get after a practice when it's like, oh, I saw Dayna, I forgot I should contact her soon, right? Like I wasn't thinking about it until I saw you. So that's always just been really helpful. But especially with COVID too, and us trying to find like creative ways to stay connected and to provide resources and support for our athletes, I've really appreciated the collaborations that have happened within the department. So partnered a lot with our student athlete enhancement group, our sports nutrition folks, and just being able to do that together has been really cool. And the unique things we've been able to provide this past year. So that's a lot of what I do as well.
So on the stigma, you bring that up, and it's something that we've talked about before. I think, John and I, just maybe being older and realizing with hindsight being 2020, how beneficial a Dr. Charbonneau would have been coming through. But I don't know that we would have embraced it at the age of 18 to 21, 22. Do you still find that? I mean, you mentioned kind of being out if people are willing to be seen with you, and you say it tongue in cheek, but do you still find that that's something that you do have to deal with in terms of the stigma of the mental health and performance?
I think it's definitely interesting working in an athletics department with so many different sport programs, like staff in each program who are coming from different experiences and backgrounds and things like that. So you definitely find some programs might be more open than others. And then that trickles down to the athletes, obviously, and the referrals that you might get and things like that. But I also just think, in society right now, and just looking at the professional sport teams and our professional athletes that are talking much more openly about the importance of mental health, and even just looking from a mental performance perspective too, right? All of our pro teams that are using mental performance coaches, mental conditioning coaches, whatever they call them, right? Help connect them to that sooner than later if they are going to get that at the next level, right? So I think, especially depending on the sport, if that's something that's been more accepted and been utilized more often, you might have more athletes reaching out sooner than later to want to use that service.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Absolutely. And one of the things, Dayna, that you said when we talked a little bit prior to the show that really resonated with me is I was sharing with you how, as we've gone through this process, Brandon and I, we've learned that, a lot of people are still aware of the stigma. They're even conscious of it from a standpoint of maybe changing some of their titles, or they work around it in the way they introduce themselves, or they are conscious of the optics of when they're talking to players and can coaches see and stuff like that. But you said something I haven't really been able to get out of my mind since you said it, because I think it's so you're on to something here. As you said, that actually in a way adds to the stigma. Like it doesn't, you know what I mean? Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I first came into the field, or even like reading old research articles that talk about kind of entering into the field and kind of coming into these spaces, a lot of folks would almost talk about trying to come at it from the mental performance lens first. And then once you have your foot in the door kind of thing, then people get comfortable, and then maybe they'll open up about mental health stuff. Right. So yeah, maybe you want to call yourself, I don't know, like a mental well-being, like whatever you want to call it, to make it sound like safer. Right. Right. But yeah, like from my perspective, if we're not calling ourselves a clinical psychologist, a counseling psychologist, whatever, we're not changing that association with the word psychologist, right? Yeah. So I think the more we keep trying to skirt around it, the more we're actually doing a disservice to ourselves and the field. And just helping folks recognize, like, a sports psychologist can be a mental performance consultant, right? And they're helping you with your overall health and well-being, and that's a good thing, and that's a really beneficial thing. If it's the end of the day, it's going to help your performance. Why is that a bad thing? Right.
Right. Absolutely.
So that's something that I am kind of, passionate about. And I want to question some folks in our field to try and like rethink that.
Yeah. Because if you're, keeping it close to the vest or running around in the shadow, so to speak, or whatever, then why would we expect anybody else to shed a light on this or to, and so I think it's a really interesting point, Brandon.
Well, along those lines, because we've had some interesting conversations too, where mental performance and counseling has almost become and we talked to it with Dr. Goodson a little bit, and you want to be careful about how you talk about this, but it has almost become a quiver in the or an arrow in the quiver, right, of recruitment. To say, hey, we have staff that will work on mental performance and counseling. I mean, that's a huge thing. And I think, to your point, Doctor, if it still has this stigma, then the programs can't really use that, right? So it benefits everybody to kind of adopt that title or whatever, whatever it should be.
Well, and I think too, right, like if I'm using the title of the sports psychologist or clinical psychologist or whatever, and then I'm in front of recruits and their families and I'm giving my spiel or whatever, they're also getting a sense that, oh, she's not like a stuffy person with a clipboard, like having me lie down on the couch kind of thing. So I'm also like actively changing that narrative right in front of them, right? Hopefully I'm coming across as much more personable and warm and whatever, just like every other staff member. So again, I think, we're actively changing those stereotypes in the same way.
I think that's an interesting point, because I would imagine that there is a certain level of like, every time I'm talking to her, is she analyzing everything I'm saying, right? Or can I just talk to her? Can I just have a conversation? So I think it's good that the more you can be seen as just, hey, I'm just out here, I have a title, just like everybody, just like your strength coach does, just like your nutritionist does, just like the director of athletics does. It's just another role within the organization.
Right. And I think you actually get those jokes from the older staff in the department and the older coaches in the department, not necessarily from the athletes, which is interesting, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Here's something that's interesting, or just kind of an observation from, we have the benefit of seeing, all of our guests, and every one of y'all is like, you'll come in, you're happy, you're like John had mentioned, right? So there definitely seems to be a with this wave coming through of young doctors that are really being put into positions of influence, and John and I have talked about it off mic a lot, about just how happy we are to know that this profession is in y'all's very, very capable hands. Looking back on it, and John, I'm surprised you hadn't asked it yet, right? Because it usually comes really early. But was there a point where you just go, hey, this is what I want to do? Because I'm curious if there are similarities in background and competitive nature and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I'll try and not go through my like entire story, because I feel like it's not linear and I can get very long-winded with it. But I think you were onto something, like giving you a very short answer. Like, yes, I wanted to be what I needed.
Right. Okay.
In a nutshell. But I don't think I knew that until grad school. I don't think I really solidified that for myself until grad school, when I really reflected on like, why was I interested in psychology in general? And I took that deep dive back into just growing up and what my growing up experience was. I mean, a little bit about me. So I'm an only child, grew up in Canada. My dad was like my role model. He was very active playing sports. I can't remember a time in my childhood where I wasn't in an ice hockey arena or on the ball diamond, like with him. And then I was very much like jumped right in when I could, playing sports. And so for me, my main sport growing up was softball, and I played competitively and I played travel ball. So, it was interesting for me when I got older looking back on it, and I was like, wow, like that was my childhood. I mean, when I think about my other friends who weren't athletes, like they were going on family vacations in the summer and doing all these other things. I was just playing ball all the time. So, I mean, pros and cons, right? But I think what's interesting for me when I look back on it is sports has always been like a source of excitement and like happiness and heartbreak at the same time, right? And there's been everything in between. And I played softball I stayed local in Canada for undergrad, and I played softball for a couple of years in college, and I was in psychology. There was a sports psych class at my university, but you couldn't take it unless you were in kinesiology, and I was in, so I was like, well, it sounds interesting, but I guess I have to put that on the back burner for now. But I was always interested in mental health disorders and found them fascinating. And so I kind of went a clinical psych route. And everyone tells you can't go anywhere with psychology unless you go to grad school. So I would have to do that. So I applied to clinical psych programs in Canada. And I had one of many setbacks that I've had over the course of my life, that as a good sports psychologist, I have had to develop a growth mindset with how to learn from setbacks. So one of them was I didn't get into grad school the first time around. So I expanded my search and I looked down into the States, and I found the clinical psych PsyD program, doc program in Indianapolis, Indiana. And actually, I had been to Indy before because I grew up a Colts fan. So that was
Nice.
that was comforting to me to end up somewhere that I had already been before. So when I got to the program, so it wasn't a sports psych program, right? So there wasn't any faculty on staff or courses offered in that. And in your second year of the program is when you start thinking about your dissertation, getting ready to go on practicum. And so you start kind of honing in on what you're interested in. And so that was really when I reflected back on what interested me, psychology in general, like what specific areas of psychology are of interest to me. And I mean, again, like so much of my growing up was sport related. And so it naturally made sense for me that when I think about it, so much of my development was in a sport context, right? And so that's just like fascinating in general. Just like, I think my interest in psychology in general just came from growing up in that context. But again, the sports psych piece that I didn't really think about till later too was, like I said, I really needed someone to talk to with the mental part of the game. I mean, we know with baseball and softball how much quote unquote failure is inherent in that game. And I never got to a point when I was still playing in the thick of it where I really embraced that failure part and learned how to like overcome the mistakes that were naturally going to happen in the game. And it would have just also been nice, even having a therapist maybe in college, right, to talk to like, how do I manage what's going on off the field that is naturally going to come on the field, right? So like you all were saying, I wish I had that resource too. And so I want to be that for them now. So yeah, long story short, that all kind of came together for me in grad school. And then I started putting things in place for myself that would give me those training opportunities when I was on an advanced practicum and I worked with my first sports psychologist supervisor and worked with my first teams and athletes and stuff. And then I had designated internship and postdoc opportunities working with athletes and teams that kind of set me up for the job that I have now. So clinical psychologist by training from the degree perspective, but I got the sports psych training along the way that set me up for this job.
Well, that's what's really interesting about our conversation that you and I had earlier was just how this role has started to evolve a little bit as it relates to how the blending of that mental psychology piece to it, in particular, like the mental health. And you were saying how on the one hand, it used to be you almost would flip a switch. It was like, we're either going to have the mental health discussion and then later have the mental performance discussion. But now it's almost become a little bit, there's been a molding of the two. Yeah.
So a lot of folks in similar positions to me, and even how the NCAA talks about it in their best practices document, is really viewing it like it's on the same continuum now, not two separate ones, right? So like on one end of the continuum is optimal performance, like when you're thriving and things are firing on all cylinders and you feel like things are going well, and then the mental health disorders are on the other end of the continuum, right? So sure, from folks who aren't clinically trained, like there's some part of the continuum where they kind of are like, okay, this is when I refer to a mental health person, right? But for the folks that have dual training, we can really work with someone on navigating that continuum, right? Depending on where they're at. And I think it can really normalize for our student athletes and help them understand that you're not stuck in one end of the continuum, right? Like if you're going through a rough patch, it doesn't mean you have to stay there, right? We can put things in place to kind of help you work back toward that other end of the continuum where you feel like things are going better. But we also, need to keep working even when things are going well. Like, what are you doing to maintain it and to not just start like neglecting your mental health or taking it for granted, right? And then something's going to come and bite you in the butt if you're not paying attention to it. So it's I enjoy thinking about it in that way. And again, we know, like, if your mental health is struggling, it's hard for it not to impact your performance on the field at some point, right? And again, if your mental performance on the field is going well, I mean, oftentimes that has a positive effect on your mental health as well.
We've talked about that a little bit too, with some other guests, where being able to mentally handle success. I mean, nobody thinks about, oh, well, things are going great. Like, how do I mentally navigate this, right? It's just, you just kind of, hey, I found a lucky penny and here we go. It just doesn't, that to me is a very, very interesting dynamic that I don't know that, at least speaking personally, I never really thought about that, about, okay, handling success from a mental performance standpoint can be as difficult as that failure. Because when you fail, you there's one way to go. Right. And when you succeed, that at some point, right, not that you're waiting for the other shoe to drop, but it's definitely something to have to prep for.
Yeah, I think we take it for granted, right? And then I don't want to say we get lazy. That's not necessarily what we do, but it reminds me of this funny thing that happens when people start taking antidepressant medication, for example, like especially some of our student athletes, they'll be taking it for a period of time. And it's kind of like, oh, well, I'm feeling so much better, so I can probably talk to my psychiatrist about stopping the medication. And
right,
it's like,
right.
Well, wait, like you're feeling better because it's working, right?
Right.
So I think, and I even find myself, like I do that sometimes too, where maybe I'll get into like a streak of meditating, and then all of a sudden I'm like, oh, things are going well, and then I'll kind of stop the streak, right?
Yeah.
It's like, sure, if I'm fine, that's okay, but what's the harm in continuing, right? I'm staying on top of it. So I think it's easy for us to let go of some of those things when it's going well, right? But what we really want to try and do is help our athletes stay proactive and stay on top of these things, just like we do with our physical health, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
We just don't always know what that looks like from a mental health perspective.
We're conditioned that way. It's why in my industry we have antibiotic resistance, is because people start feeling better and they stop taking their medication, and away we go. That's why we have resistant bugs and all those things. How often would you say, and I always kind of caution myself in asking these questions right as I'm getting ready to ask you this question anyhow, is what percentage on average would you say of the athletes that you deal with, and maybe from that mental performance side, there's something underlying, whether big or small, but there's another layer that you find to be the case? And have you found that to have gotten more frequent as you've been in this industry, or what's that look like?
That's a good question. I think maybe just coming from a clinical background and just like how I probably go about asking questions in those first couple conversations with athletes, I think I'm naturally digging for stuff under the surface.
Rolling stuff out, yeah.
So I think I'll always find something if I'm really looking for it. And I think that goes back to like how I also view like what contributes to us experiencing distress in the first place. And I'm a very relationship focused person. I think a lot of stuff comes from like our early upbringing and patterns that we develop, and emotional patterns and stuff too, right? With how we cope with things and everything. So I think I can tend to find something that's fitting with that. So I don't know if, I mean, maybe I would say 100%, like I could find comes from something. People will probably disagree with me a little bit on that. But I honestly think that would be my answer.
Well, let me ask you this question, because in our world, when I say that, Brandon and I am coming from the business side of things. So over the last probably 5 years, and it's probably even been a little bit longer than that, EQ, emotional intelligence, all of these things have become the buzzwords, right? And I know you and I started to get into this a little bit when we talked. I know a lot of the listeners are like, man, I would love to have been on that phone call. Like, why? He's like talking about all these things.
Hey, listen, I'm just surprised she showed up. I'm like, how much John Cullen can one person take?
Yeah, we talk all the time. It's like once a week.
Me and Dr. Charbonneau. Yeah. Hey, you didn't know this. He thinks you're his doctor now, by the way.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So, but I do think that there's become, and I think it kind of goes back to what I was just talking about and how the evolution of your role, But emotions, dealing with emotions, these young student athletes, and we always emphasize this when we're talking to not only people like yourself in your role, but some of the coaches we've had on. These are young 17, 18, 19, 20-year-olds. This whole emotional intelligence in the business world, we're talking about people who are a lot older, who don't know how to handle things, don't know how to adjust to their feelings and emotions or whatever. So when you get that person who's 17, 18, 19, 20, who doesn't know what they're even feeling, and you have some really good insights into this because it goes back to that labeling, like mental toughness. So share some of the thoughts you have around like handling emotions. And then when you're getting these players, what's some of the challenges you've had because of the fact that they're not maybe prepared to handle those emotions yet?
Yeah, well, you bring up you're spot on with the developmental piece. And then I also, again, just think of the sport culture piece, like you were just talking about with, quote unquote, mental toughness and what that means. And just thinking about the messages we hear growing up in sport related to emotions, right? Like no crying, suck it up, like all those kinds of things, right? And for a lot of our athletes, that contributes to them getting used to, I just push through it, right? I find a way to deal with it on my own or whatever it is. Right. And so it's fascinating kind of when they get here in a different context, there's a lot more they have to manage, right? There's more stressors getting thrown at them. And hey, even if you think that pattern was working for you in high school and maybe you got by, it might not work now in this context. Right. And so I try and kind of prepare them for that too. Like this is going to be potentially different. And we just might need to adjust, right? And practice doing some things a little bit differently than you've done before. And so I do really, like a lot of our athletes joke about how I've made them feel and things like that, like they've never felt before. And I'm really making them tap into that and learning that feelings are okay and they can be really helpful, even if they're scary. But a lot of our athletes who haven't gotten used to letting themselves cry, like letting themselves feel like anger and sadness and the wide range of their emotions, that can be really scary at first because sometimes they don't think they have time for it. Right. Like if I let myself cry, does that mean like my whole night's thrown off? Right. And I'm not going to get anything done. And that's realistic for some of them. If you've gotten used to bottling up a lot of things, the first couple times you let yourself feel it, it probably is going to come out a little bit more intense. But what I try and help a lot of our athletes practice with that like emotion regulation piece and like coping with their emotions is the more you're practicing it and the more you're learning about yourself and you're identifying what your emotions are communicating to you and stuff like that, the more you notice that intensity shifts over time and you start feeling more capable of managing it and not having to be like afraid of your emotions or feeling like you're at the mercy of your emotions when they're coming over you.
I think that's a really interesting component is just even the introduction of certain emotions, like how to even identify them. I know I went through some counseling when I was probably in my mid 30s. Right. And it was the first time that anyone asked me to like, as you go through your day, journal some stuff and write down how you're feeling. Mm-hmm. And so I remember like giving it to the doctor and she looked at it and she goes, okay, Brandon, there's 3 things. She's like, you're either happy, sad, or mad. Like, is that really the emotional, like, is that really all you can identify? And at the time I was like, I guess, because I don't even know where to begin to identify or define what I was feeling. It just kind of fell into this larger bucket. Right. And I remember she gave me a sheet. Yeah. Right. And there's like 50. And I'm like, I looked at it and I said, all these are emotions. I mean, it was kind of like getting that 64 box of crayons and going, I didn't know cyan was a color like this. I just didn't even know. So I think it's really interesting what you said there, where part of even learning to cope and deal is to just identify that these things even exist to begin with. And that can be scary, right?
But it also is meant, and you hit on it, Dayna, when you said this idea of mental toughness what coaches, I think, need to understand is there is an inherent need for players to please the coach. And so when they are saying words, and this is why it's so important to make sure you're always in line with you're aligned on terminology with your athletes. And we've talked about this on shows before, because when I say mental toughness, if that player, to your point, believes I just have to be absolutely disconnected from my emotions and things like that, well, when you come in and start saying, hey, let's get in touch with some of these feelings, if they think, well, if I start being in touch with my emotions, my coach is going to recognize that as not mental toughness. And so therefore, I'm probably not going to be somebody who's going to see the field, the court, whatever the case may be. And that becomes almost like a tug of war between you and the coaches. Does that happen where, not intentionally, because I'm sure you guys are always trying to work in alignment, but from a player's perspective, they see you on one side and the coach on the other side?
Yeah, that's a good point. I definitely think that could come into play. It's been more interesting, I think, having more coaches seeing the side and what happens when their players are bottling it up and then it comes out. And so I think they're seeing more negative consequences of that. And so then they're actually asking their athletes to come talk through the things that they need to talk through. I don't know if they're still thinking like, oh, so then you just like won't have anything coming up and like
right
or whatever that looks like. But I think they're recognizing that there needs to be some level of balance there and not going to one extreme or the other. For at least some coaches, I think, have been starting to shift that around.
But I think there, and we've talked about it before, John, you just mentioned it about being aligned. I think most coaches, when they're talking about mental toughness, they're just talking about, hey, don't go out there and quit. Don't allow your mind to shut down before your body needs to, so that when we're in the fourth quarter or we're in the ninth inning or whatever it is, you have something in the tank to call upon that says, hey, I'm a little bit of a savage here, and let's get after it, right? Versus being emotionally hollow, right? That to me, there's a difference there, right? I don't need you to be a serial killer. I just need you to be able to control your mind, right? So
yeah, that's a good point. And I've really enjoyed when you can have those conversations with coaches too. And if coaches are in a place with their teams where they're trying to improve their relationships or communication with their players, and they're able to start talking about these things, because in the heat of the moment, yeah, you are getting a very quick message that you don't always know how to interpret, or you're interpreting it one way and coach meant one way, right? So if they can kind of talk about it in between, like, this is what I meant, how are you hearing that? Or how are you defining that?
Right.
And we can kind of work together to make sure we're on the same page. I think that you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
That can be a lot more helpful.
What's it mean to you when I say this? And it's so important. And it's important for coaches to model it. I mean, it's one thing to be talking it, but if you're not modeling it as a coach, if you're that person who seems disconnected from your emotions and block, and I mean, I don't mean to put the coaches, in the spotlight here, but there is a lot that goes on. It's that do as I say, not as I do in the coaching profession. And it can be very challenging for that athlete who's stuck in the middle to try to figure out, okay, what exactly are they trying to get across to me? What do they want me to do? What is it where do you see this going? Like, where do you see the next step? Because it seems like we're making such good strides. And as Brandon was saying earlier, this is the future. I mean, you see so many people who are energetic and enthusiastic about this. Where do you see it all kind of going? Hopefully more people on staffs.
Right. Yes, absolutely. Well, I think just a word that I've already said that I'll keep saying is just shifting to more of a proactive approach versus this reactive approach, right? Because even like the fact that I'm a clinical psychologist, I mean, clinical psychology definitely stems from this like mental illness, fix it kind of realm, right? And I think we're still falling into that sometimes of like, okay, we have people on staff to check a box for the athletes that are like really struggling, right? And they like very obviously have to go talk to somebody. But it's just as important for us to be putting services and resources and having those talks with the athletes, even when things are going relatively okay. But, you know, again, we just want to stay on top of it and check in about our plan and check in about how we're using our coping strategies and whatever it is, from that proactive perspective, right? Which, again, in the short term might not always see what that's doing, right? But in the long term, like if that's saving us from more crisis management kinds of things, I mean, that seems like a win in my perspective. So I think the more we can shift to more of this proactive lens, from both the mental health and the mental performance side of things, I think that would be wonderful. And being able to infuse us more, just like you have more strength and conditioning folks, more athletic trainers, more access, and just continuing to reduce the stigma with that as well.
So one of the things that people don't always realize about, let's say, you know, strength and conditioning is it's not just about being more explosive and stronger and all that. It's about injury prevention. So right. When you think about this from a preventive standpoint, prevention, you know, are there certain things, and we've asked this question before, but are there certain things that we could start as parents, as coaches at the high school level, could start infusing now into some of these younger players that might help in that preventive medicine almost before they get to you and you guys are, you know, having to tap into those emotions for the first time and the person's like wailing in the corner of your office for 2 hours, you know?
Well, I love how you've asked this question on a lot of your shows. And I guess to tap into more of the emotional conversation we've had today and kind of go with that, I always want to encourage parents to provide a space to have conversations about emotions and how your kids are doing, right? I know that it's hard as parents not just parents, but like anyone close to the person who's struggling, not to jump to like a problem solving, like I want to fix your pain kind of mode and take it away from you, right? But it's so powerful just to like sit there and listen and engage in active listening skills and validate how someone's feeling. And yeah, that would be really scary, right? Or it makes sense why you feel so sad when that happened. And kind of being able to have more of those opportunities where we're not, oh no, you're okay, or oh, but what about this thing? And you know, trying to kind of put a Band-Aid on it or shift away from it or dismiss it in some kind of way. I know that COVID and what happened was like a huge opportunity when everyone was going back home, and especially for our athletes and our youth athletes, right? Like everyone was going through a grieving process when seasons got cut, you know, graduation ceremonies looked different, prom was taken away, like all these different things were happening. And I know a lot of parents were struggling, like, how do I support my kids right now? And I'm trying to be a teacher and a parent and everyone else at the same time. I know that was a really hard time for everyone. And we tried to talk a lot about, you know, recognizing the stages of grief, right? And your kids are going to be feeling a lot of different things. And if we try and stifle that process, it's actually going to prolong it, right? So we got to just let them feel through whatever they need to feel through. And then we can kind of settle into that level of acceptance, not that we have to like what's happening, but we have to find a way to be in the present moment in order to kind of move forward to what's next, right? So
it's so, I love everything you just said, because you think about this, and we talk about this from a mental performance standpoint, as far as those thoughts that come into your head. And we've talked before about neutral thinking and accepting the thought and letting the thought pass and all that. But what you just said there about emotions really resonates with me, because I've heard parents say this all the time: is it's okay, you're all right. And you're exactly right. That does teach that person, well, oh, this is just something that I either have to push aside, not deal with, or whatever. And one of the things that we find is if you do that with your thoughts from a mental performance standpoint, that's dangerous, because number one, you need to accept the fact that you're having this thought, but just let that thought pass. the same thing with emotions, like you're saying, is when your son or daughter is saying, hey, I'm feeling really nervous about this, or I'm feeling very anxious about this, or whatever, you need to, let's talk about it. There's a great book, and I've referenced this on this show before, called Elephant in the Room. And it talks about I think it's like dealing with the elephant in the room or something like that. But it talks about the fact that the elephant came into the room small, and had you just gotten the elephant out of the room through the door that it came into, it'd been fine, but it's because we let it sit and manifest itself. And it's the same thing with emotions, is if you're not addressing it and getting that out of the room, then it's festering in there. But I know I've gone on too long about this, but it's just one of those things that when you said it about it's okay, it resonated with me, because you hear so many parents say that.
Well, and because we also lose the opportunity to recognize that your emotions are there for a reason, right? Like there's a function to all of our emotions. And we've gotten into this bad habit of thinking that some emotions are quote unquote good and some are bad, right? And that's just not true. I mean, the fact that we were sad or we were angry when our seasons got cut and everything, that sadness came up because you lost something that was important to you, right? And it helps you remember and recognize the things that are important to you, right? Because if you didn't feel sad, you probably would learn that I didn't care about this thing as much as I did, right? So like we're also losing that information when we don't sit with and pay attention to our emotions. Like that, like when I'm stressed out about something in particular, it probably means something to me, right? Or there's like some real threat here that I have to pay attention to. And if I'm ignoring it, I might hurt myself because I'm not paying attention to the threat, right? So our emotions are all important. I think we just get caught up in the fact that some feel more comfortable and pleasant than others, but we can build our muscle in being able to sit with the uncomfortable ones and feel like we can still manage them even when they're uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Well, it's your body's emotional way to deal with, like you said, with that, to use an injury almost, right? It's a lot like what they're talking about now, where, if you have an injury, your body's natural reaction is to swell and get inflamed, right? And a lot of studies are starting to show that before you run and put ice on it, before you do ibuprofen, let the body react the way that the body needs to react, because there's some injury prevention that's actually going on here, right? If you cover it up, to your point, doctor, if you cover that up too quickly, you don't know that you're hurt. So you don't, there's no way that you could potentially go out and injure yourself even worse if you don't allow yourself the opportunity to address it the way it needs to be addressed.
Right. And it's interesting, right? Like even after we do a workout, and a lot of us embrace the fact that if I'm sore the next day or the day after, that's a good thing. It means my muscles are building and whatever. Right. But it's like we can get to a point where we can embrace like, okay, I'm going to be hurting right now, but it's going to be temporary. And that means that like I'm working through it. Right. Whereas some folks still have a harder time recognizing that. And so like you're saying, the more we push against it, the more we're just prolonging that process.
Yeah. So this makes me think of something is, I'm sure there's times as you're reading articles and things like that you're like, wow, that's a different approach to something. Has there been anything recently you've read or maybe a different way to think about something that's kind of got your mind thinking like, wow, that's really interesting. Anything that you think of?
I mean, I was just thinking about it when we were talking about this like emotional soreness kind of piece, but I was just listening to a podcast recently. And as we're talking about like embracing our emotions and feeling them more, and this podcast was focusing on vulnerability too. And they were talking about, when we're practicing being vulnerable more often, there's like this natural vulnerability hangover. And so like just that term, I hadn't heard of it in that way before. But I guess just because we're talking about this right now, it made me think of that there's this natural like hangover part that's going to feel uncomfortable, but it doesn't mean that it's still not like a valuable part of that process. Yeah.
So you've been doing this role for a little while now. What fascinates you the most about the student athletes you work with?
Oh gosh, they always manage to amaze me with certain things that they say or what they do. But I just appreciate, because I've been here for almost 4 years now, and so I've been working with folks going into their senior year that I worked with since their freshman year and stuff like that. And I'm always just so grateful to be a part of their journey.
Right.
And when they're excited to jump on a Zoom call, if that's what we're doing now, or just me. And so as we were just talking about, ways that I challenge people to approach versus avoid their emotions or uncomfortable experiences or stuff like that. Like when a student athlete's like, "Oh, Dayna, you'll never believe what I just did." And we
so
remember
cool.
in freshman year when this one thing was so terrifying to them. And now they're actively challenging themselves to do it on their own. And then it wasn't as scary as they thought or whatever.
That's awesome.
Those are things that really stand out to me, that I'm so grateful to be a part of that process.
That's a great thing as a coach too, is to see that evolution through the 4 years, and when you do see it and you watch that growth, especially for you now where you're dealing with them in those vulnerable situations, right? Where they've opened up to you. And now all of a sudden, that not only did this help them as student athletes at West Virginia University, this is going to help them be a better mom, a better wife, a better husband, a better, son, all of those things in the long run, which is a really cool thing. And it's, I don't know. I think I have a lot of respect for the things that you all are doing out there. Do you work with any one team more than others, like any certain sports at the college, or is it mostly just all of them?
Yeah, I work with some sports more than others. Before I got here, since there wasn't a full-time provider in-house before, but we do have a doctoral program in sport and exercise psych at WVU, and some of the students in that program had historically been matched with some of our teams, and they kind of do a 2-year kind of rotation. So some of our teams work with some of the students, which helps me. I just have a little bit of oversight in terms of what they're doing. So some of the other sports, especially some of the higher profile sports that maybe haven't always used a student, I'm available for them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's cool. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so football and basketball and some of those the ones on campus that most people would kind of be aware of.
Football is always fun, and it's a huge team, and sometimes it can seem kind of overwhelming, right? Of how do you even tackle that? But I think it's always cool to be creative with breaking things down in position groups. And again, it's just going to depend, right? Some position coaches might really be bought in more than others and want to tap into that resource more than others. So I just continue to value the relationship building part. And the more that, maybe some coaches had never really been exposed to sports psych before. So they don't always know even how do I use you? And so sometimes it's what does that look like? And then once you start working together, and maybe it's okay, I can see this working. But I think for some coaches, there's still a fear of, if I'm putting some of my time towards this, and it's getting taken away from practice time, if they haven't done it before, it can maybe feel a little scary to them. So
that's where I feel like football is probably one of the most challenging sports, because number one, it's a big melting pot of a lot of different cultures that a lot of these players have come from, a lot of different backgrounds and experiences in life. And that you really get into that whole sheltering themselves from that emotional piece, because that's in their mind now maybe been brought up as a sign of weakness, whatever the case may be. And quite frankly, some of those football coaches, especially those old school football coaches, still believe that's the quote unquote edge, right? That anger, frustration that you've talked about before, that's a needed part of this. I like my players playing with a little bit of anger to them,
Right. No, it has been cool though. And like we said, the more that professional teams and stuff use these resources more, and you just talked about an edge, and there is a competitive edge, right? I mean, a lot of our coaches, when they see other coaches in the same conference doing something or using some resource, and they want to jump on and do the same thing. So, I mean, for better or for worse, that still happens. And if that includes sports psych, and and that's great. Like, so
Yeah.
we'll use it to our advantage. But again, COVID was an interesting year with a lot of our teams doing more stuff over Zoom and everything. And sometimes that was a nice opportunity for us to be creative with, doing videos for them or whatever it was to like, introduce them a little bit more to what we can provide and give them a little bit more. So yeah. Still a process.
If a couch's life, they get Dr. Charbonneau. If they're going to be burning couches after a win or a loss at WVU, they get Doctor.
Yeah.
They don't get the students.
She might be out there. We don't know. I mean, I don't. Hey. She might be the one who's like pulling the couch out. She's like, hey, I was getting ready to redesign my living room anyhow, so this worked out perfect.
Hey, this couch made me angry.
Right? Yeah. New interventions every day. I'm trying.
Yeah. So you've listened to the show enough that here's a question I like to I like to ask, or at least I would like to ask, especially those that are working with college athletes. But if you could go back, you mentioned the 4 years you've been on campus there and kind of that evolution and seeing some of those players. If you could go back and implant the one mental skill, I could just give you one, you can gift any of your incoming freshmen one mental skill that's going to hopefully best set them up for success. What would it be?
Ooh, I wasn't prepared for this one. One mental skill to prepare them.
Oh, wait, y'all didn't talk about this on the mysterious 4-hour phone call / therapy session that you had with John?
I am going to say something along the lines of like mental or emotional flexibility.
Yeah.
Great.
That makes sense.
I think that would be mine now after this conversation. I mean, seriously, I think that is it's really made me think differently. And I love when something comes up that I think makes me think differently. And the way you unpack that about that mental flexibility or that emotional flexibility, and really, I wish you would have been around 24 years ago when I was raising my son. I feel like I could have been a better parent had I just had this conversation a while back, because I might have been the one who's like, "Oh, suck it up." Like,
I can't even see the bone, barely. Get out there.
Well, hindsight's always 20/20. But I mean, I feel like I even did that to myself growing up, right? Like, again, we just internalize some of that stuff too.
Yeah,
I think.
Well, that's the Canada thing too, right? It's hockey. It's like, get out there and
just get into a fight.
It's only a tooth. I've got like 40 other ones, right? Like one chiclet's not going to matter.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
But I know my athletes get so sick of hearing me say it doesn't have to be one emotion or the other. You can hold both at the same time.
Right. They're like, okay, we get it. Yeah, that's awesome though. But it really is one of those things that I think, you can easily see where that would be beneficial for. And hopefully the more conversations like that they're having, I just think it's going to be more, it'll definitely be valuable for them in the long run. So sure. Well, we've really, the hour goes fast, and I know, with us, it probably drags on.
Well, I was going to say, it depends on what side of the microphone you're on. She's like, oh my goodness.
He's like, really?
This is fun.
You thought that was fast?
I love it. I'm laughing, so I'm clearly enjoying myself.
That's good. Yeah. Well, we could always provide the laughs. There's no doubt about that. But we really, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to join us. I know, you just kind of finished up the school year, and I know that doesn't mean your work stops, but it's definitely been enjoyable for us, and we definitely want you to come back and talk to us about some of the things as things evolve. And, if there is something that you're working on in the future, as far as just, hey, this is a different angle that we're starting to do with the student athletes or whatever, definitely reach out to us, because we'd love to hear about it and just check in with you from time to time.
Cool. Yeah, I look forward to that. I'm definitely excited to hop on at some point in the future again.
Awesome.
Great. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We really enjoyed it.
Me too.
All right.
Have a great night.
You too.
Want to provide feedback or stay up to date with the show? Visit our Instagram page at Mental Advantage Podcast, or you can send us an email at podcast@mentaladvantage.net. To have John Cullen work with you or your team, please write to him at john.cullen@mentaladvantage.net. Thanks for listening to today's episode.